Alright, so this is just a quick overview of Chapter 2, The Power of Culture. And so, to start off with what is culture, and some define it as a social system of rules, language, customs, rituals, arts, government, expectations, norms, values, or ideals that people share. And now there are two ways of looking at culture. There's the explicit form, and these are the more observable elements of culture. Things like what you can see or what you hear, the things that you see that are being worn, the food that is being eaten, their location, living situation. These are the very observable elements of culture. And implicit culture is the more hidden elements that aren't seen on the forefront, such as the values that a culture carries or the assumptions and perspectives that they have on their personal environment and surrounding world, or even like their beliefs and philosophies within their culture, like their religion or ritual, And so those are two different ways of how to define culture. It's a very loosely definition and can be viewed in many different ways, but this is one good way of looking at it. And now, as we focus on the model of culture, the chapter 2 breaks it down into 3 levels. As I was saying, there's level 1, that surface level, and this can be identified as the artifacts, like the language and the dialect spoken within their culture, the history, and even like the children's games that they play. Level 2 deals with the behaviors and patterns of interactions. And so the tone of voice and also the nonverbals and like the eye contact, like do we look you directly in the eyes or do we look down at your feet to show respect? The ways that they greet each other and say farewell. And of course, like, the roles that they play in society. And level 3 is the implicit components of culture. So again, it is those values and beliefs and things that aren't so observable on the surface. So their spirituality, the laws, the fears, the standards that they have, and the set expectations. And there is also mainstream culture versus subculture. And so mainstream would be the dominant culture in the given environment. So this can change from one place to another. It could be as small as from one county to the next, or it can be from one state or one country to the next. And this involves the experiences and values of the dominant class. And so the dominant class usually determines, what holidays are celebrated, like whose faces are on their currency is also a big thing about that, which I thought was interesting because I never viewed that. And so it's kind of cool to think like, oh, of course, like that does show a good example of what the dominant culture is within that certain part of the world. And the subculture is the smaller communities within these mainstream, within the dominant cultures that have shared features that sets them apart from the mainstream. And so they can have differing religions and holidays from the dominant culture, but it is still a culture experience within the people of that location. Now, focusing on institutional racism has been a very big topic recently, and actually has been an ongoing conversation for many decades now. And it is basically a system of legalized policies that are used to protect the continued rule of the dominant group. And even as us as educators, the school curriculum itself can be used as a tool to reinforce these ideas of institutional racism, such as ethnocentrism, where we teach history from the perspective of the dominant culture, and the censoring of stories of the subcultures, where we ignore the atrocities that we may have done to certain subcultures that the dominant culture rules over. And that is just one small example of institutional racism, but it can be very extensive as well. This chapter also talks about cultural identity, and this can be defined as the identity of an individual developed from any affiliations or interactions that they have from a various number of communities. Now there is the cultural traditionalist, which they remain faithful to the beliefs and the patterns and the culture of their native language. And so say if someone were to move from one place to the next, and maybe they're not the part of the mainstream culture anymore, but they remain faithful to whatever culture they held in their hometown or wherever they came from. And now bicultural identity kind of blends the two together, where they adapt or they adopt certain aspects of the mainstream society while also remaining or while also retaining some of their ethnic communities, like cultural patterns and beliefs and language. And assimilationist is the exact opposite of the cultural traditionalists, where they completely attach themselves to the mainstream society and they essentially cut off all ties to their ethnic community, and it's no longer as important, where they just want to become part of that mainstream culture. But it's also important to keep in mind that our cultural identity can't really be just tied up into a neat little box, that we are actually defined by so much more beyond these things, and that kind of goes more into detail with the many subcultures that we affiliate ourselves with. And so that can be a very unique thing, even within a given family. Like say if one sibling has like a really strong attachment to sports, so they're a part of that subculture of the outdoor community or the competitive community, while the other sibling might be a very passionate musician, and so then they have their own culture within that musical realm. And so there are many things that can be applied and play into the development of an individual's cultural identity. As for culturally relevant education, this is very important as educators to keep in mind. And this is defined as the inclusion of various cultural backgrounds and experiences among your students within the curriculum. And so why is that important? Well, it really helps to establish this feeling of respect and commitment as a teacher to our students. It shows that we are caring, we are listening to them and where they come from, and it helps to foster these stronger bonds and supports our desires to make connections with our students, and also to take their prior experiences and connect that to this newer knowledge that we wish to teach them and model for them and build upon their development as students. And so how can we do this? Well, a good way to do this is to ask students for their opinions on real life issues or issues within their communities, find out about what community that they live in, and also be mindful of how we can become a cultural mediator for them. And so as teachers, it's important for us to educate students on the differences in values and social context from one culture to the next, and that each student has a different background and different upbringing. And especially if you're in a very diverse school where you have students from all over the world, it's very important to be mindful of what cultures are present in your classroom and what are certain ways that you can bring each of those diverse backgrounds into your curriculum so that the students can feel represented and included in the studies. And it really helps to also make what you're teaching relevant to them. And so you're really affirming both the home and school cultures in doing so. And so, of course, there are many challenges in our attempts to become a good cultural mediator in our classrooms. And so the best way, of course, is to gain cultural knowledge. And so I really like the idea of collecting information from your students themselves, just a very safe, private, one-on-one conversation, essentially through a survey where you're giving your students an opportunity to share things about their culture that they maybe have pride about, and you want to give them that sense of pride, to be proud of where they come from. And also, of course, be knowledgeable of the cultural conflicts that your students face. And so it's really just about seeking these channels to build understanding between teacher and student and creating that safe environment where they feel confident in taking risks and taking on challenges and not being afraid to ask questions. And so a way to build this and also maintain it is, of course, through communication and collaboration with the social workers, the school liaisons, the community counselors, just the professionals that are around you that are all working to try to create this safe and fun learning environment for each and every student that comes through. And that about wraps up what Chapter 2 had in store for us. Thank you.